Okay, so we're live. So over the last week, I've been puttering around with certain things. I'm trying to get some of this code locked down so it won't be getting changed in the future. And I thought for my first thing, I'd take the simplest little bit of code and just put it out on Reddit and see what response I got and see if I could lock it down, make it available for other people to use, simplify it. And I thought my Autostager was nice and simple. So I posted it. I got some great feedback. My original Autostager basically went through, you can see it here. The first thing it did after, it periodically runs, and every second it's enumerating the engine list. And another reader correctly pointed out this is not that efficient. Among other things, as the rockets get larger, the engine list is going to get longer. This is going to get less efficient to do. It is more general, so there are some corner cases this catches. He suggested instead making the decision based on the maximum thrust, because in practice, the only time your maximum thrust changes is when you ignite engines or when they flame out, and you need to use max thrust at 0 to get your vacuum thrust. So I thought, let's do that. The core of it is basically we sample max thrust at each call and compare it with the value from before. And if it goes down, we need to stage because we flamed out an engine and we want to discard the engine and its fuel tanks. We also want to stage if we've got 0 thrust, because if we have 0 thrust, we want to stage to ignite the next engine. The other thing we need to watch for is if we have 0 thrust, we do need to look and see if we've got any engines. So we enumerate the engines and we say, do we have any engines? There may be a better way of saying, do I have any engines than checking the length of the engine list. I think I saw a all engines list that's kept by KSP. I didn't look at that quite yet. I will revert this code at some point. Well, not revert it. I will update the code to use that if it's there. Anyway. Oh, also, new mic. Yay. My old headset broke. One of the earpieces went poof. So new headset and new microphone, and I hope it's coming through okay. So a couple things I do here. One special case that I wanted to cover was if something else stages, I want the Autostager to do the right thing. Now, if somebody stages and the new stage has less total thrust than we had a moment ago, then the Autostager, the way it was originally written, would have staged again. Not good. So what I do is I not only keep track of current and previous max thrust, but current and previous stage number. So if the stage number changed, or if we have thrust and it's same as the old, then we're done. So there's two conditions. Either the stage number changed, in which case we just return 1 and try again in a second. Or if we have thrust and it's the same as we had before, we're also done because we're just burning. If we get through that, then we say, if we have no thrust, see if there's engines, and if there's no more engines, we're going to print a message and terminate. Return 0 is how we terminate these tasks. We've got to check at the top. I've been trying to tune this so that it does not deploy parachutes that are in stage 0. Now, maybe the way to do that is to check the engine list again after I stage to see if we staged away the last engines, and if we did, we're done. I will evaluate that. That would be enumerating the engine list twice. The other thing we could do is enumerate the engine list once before staging, and simply, well, we'd have to actually walk through the list. Anyway, so there's the Autostager. That's the number one change. The second thing was we had a back and forth on the mechanism that was being used to call it. I was actually using a when-then clause, which makes it a trigger, which means that it's running at interrupt priority, which is kind of not a good thing. It's not really background. He called me out on the terminology, and I agree. Calling it a background task was wrong. It's an interrupt service task. and making an interrupt service was bad. So now Autostager is going to run in normal priority. How do we do that? Well, the core of that is this scheduler. And I'm trying to apply the single responsibility principle. So the scheduler says, you call me and you tell me a time and a task to run, and I will assure that that task is run at that time. That's all. The other half of it is the execution loop. We dive into the execution loop. It runs at normal priority, so this isn't in a when clause. This is just it's going to use waits. And all we do is we say, wait until the task on the front of the list is ready to go, the time is right, and then we execute it, we remove it. Oh, interesting thing, task list : remove. List remove is an atomic operation, so we will not be preempted by a when clause. So in theory, we could have when clauses that modify the task list. So what we're doing here is we pick up the guy on the front of the task list. If somebody inserts in the front of the task list, then it's going to be somebody who's, before time seconds. So this task here, task sub 0, may be a different task from this task here, but I need to putting task list 00 in the wait until, so it reevaluates it. Each time through, it has to pick up the first element from task list, and then its contents can pick up the first element from there, which is the time. So now we pick up the task, whatever's on the front. When we know we've got something to do, we're going to remove that from the task list, and we're going to be done. Now, if we get interrupted between sampling task and removing it, we could remove a new task that got placed on the front of the list by a interrupt that occurred after we sampled this. I haven't figured out how to handle that yet, because I don't think there's a task list that removes the, essentially what I want is like a queue pop. I can't treat this as a queue because I want to insert in the middle of it. But I can't pop it off of the front atomically and say, give me the first element while removing it. I can ask for the first element and I can remove it. But those two operations I don't see any way of doing those atomically. So for now, we do have a multi-thread hazard here. So for now, I'm going to avoid manipulating the task list from within a trigger. Then we call the task. The task returns a delay time. If the delay is positive, then we're going to schedule the task again. If it's 0 or negative, we don't do the task again. So real simple. We schedule tasks, we run them, and we continue running them based on their own delay requests. So, so we loop back through schedule. There is the idea of doing pauses and resumes and cancels in order to keep this code simple, because not all tasks are going to want those. This code will not directly support them. If you want to have a task that is pausable, then you'll need a wrapper around this that takes your delegate and adds a little bit of a framework around it to allow you to pause it or unpause it or cancel it. And when that framework is called here, the framework will say, oh, I've been paused, so I better return an appropriate time to start it back up again. Or I've been canceled, so I'm going to return a 0 so I don't get called again. So any pauses and cancels would have to happen in whoever calls schedule. Okay? So you have to wrap them. But that keeps this code simple. The other part of this, execute itself doesn't return. So we're sitting here, we are the main thread, and we are looping, and we are doing our wait until. So we're friendly about it, but we really are looping. We are the main thread, which means that our main sequencer, our mission stuff, the mission go and mission foreground and background, mission background gets turned into calling schedule, and mission foreground gets turned into calling execute. So we need to do that. So here's sequence. Sequence is basically a API compatible drop-in replacement for mission. For now, I'm keeping them separate. I want to make sure this works before I start having all of my existing missions suddenly using SEQ. maybe what will happen is once I've verified it, I will just rename this to mission and get rid of the old mission code. It's very similar. I've changed the names of the non-volatile storage so that they can coexist without stomping on each other. The code is very, very similar. Where it differs is the Go previously had a loop in it where it would execute things. And now what it does is it says, I am going to have a task that gets called that says do one mission phase. And I'm going to schedule that with the scheduler, and then I'm going to have the scheduler go execute. So the mission go or sequence go is still the thing you call that doesn't return until you're done. So run phase, sorry, I still have a bit of a cough. Run phase does what we did before, which is pick up our phase number, calling into mission phase or seek phase to get the correct phase number, which might be persistent. We select the next phase. We call the task. This is the same as we had before. So we dip into the phase list at that index. We call that task and it returns a DT. Now, if some mission phase, say, returns 5, we've got nothing else we need to do. We're just going to return that 5 to the scheduler and it'll call us back in 5 seconds. We'll do it again, which is perfect. If it returns 0 or negative, then we need to do this. So we pre-calculated our next phase number. If you return 0 or negative, we are going to continue execution with the next phase after you. If you return 0, it's essentially 0 delay. We don't want to return a 0 here because if we return 0, that says stop calling the main sequencer. So we'll return something very small. If you return to -1, then we want to cause a delay of 1 second before running the next phase. I just realized this is a bit odd. So what I want to do is actually return min of 1/1000th, comma, minus dt. There we go. So if I return -5 from a task here, then we're going to step to the next task in the main sequencer, and we're going to return 5, saying from the next phase in 5 seconds. If I return 0, we step to the next one, and I'm going to return 1 millisecond. Now, nothing happens in 1 millisecond in KSP, but we do want to force, if you return 0, we do want to force you to going onward, to the next tick before the next phase. I'm going to force a tick transition when you return 0. I don't know whether this was the same. Actually, let's see. Let's bring up mission foreground. So if you return to 0, we would do a wait 0, which is the next tick. So this is no change to the behavior. That's good. So there we have it. We have the new sequencer, which uses the new scheduler. And now we can use the new scheduler to schedule things like our automatic RCS and our automatic staging. So now let's take a look at our mission plan for this mission. This is going to be T for tourist, mission 5. Now this is actually inheriting a lot of code from the Mun Science orbit. So there are a number of functions here I have not yet put into the library. I have renamed some of them. This tourist orbit is going to be an equatorial orbit, so a lot of the complexity goes away. Not complexity of the code. The code doesn't change a whole lot, but the mission itself looks simpler. We still have this whole thing, but I have gone through and verified things. Like, for instance, we are always using the plan facility. I've collected together all of the bits of code that generated maneuver nodes, and that's in plan. So, for instance, the initial circularization, instead of just diving into tune our current velocity to be circular, which could be a big burn, first I'm saying, before we get there, let's plan a maneuver node to circularize at our apoapsis. And that will correctly start the burn halfway, straddle it. So plan circ, AP, and then plan go. And then once we have done the maneuver node, we're going to be close to circular. And we use the existing circularization tune-up to make it exact. This happens all over the place. The Mun orbit, for instance, we use circ-PE to say schedule circularization of the periapsis and so on. Change the wording here a little bit. This used to be, gather science. But by and large, it's mostly the same code that we've used before. And down at the bottom, our code to start the Autostager and the Auto RCS. The only difference here is now we're calling SCS schedule. It's doing it as a base priority level thing rather than as a trigger. So a little more friendly there. And we set a starting time, and the Autostager and Auto RCS will return a value saying how often they want to be called. That's fine. And sequence go. So sequence go will return when all of our phases go away, which actually won't happen because phase park lasts forever. So there we have it. There's the new code. The mission plan itself, as I said, it's the same as the orbital science, except we're going equatorial instead of polar. So let's go ahead and actually fly this. So VS code goes away. Bada boom. So this is a tourist. But the reason why I did this was because I have 4 tourists who wanted to go around the moon. Now, I was doing a whole bunch of tourism. I thought I had normal, just, take me in orbit around Kerbin. And I got these 4 tourists, and I launched them, and they came back, and they said, this isn't everything we wanted. They had more. So notice flyby Mun, and these guys orbit Mun. So, yeah, apparently these guys were okay. So we are going to go ahead and launch this. Oh, the ship itself is somewhat larger. I could have used the same basic layout as the ship that I did orbital science with, but it could only carry 1 Kerbal. And I thought, that takes a long time to do 1 Kerbal at a time. So I used this trick that let's pause this for a moment. This trick that I did for orbital science, orbital Kerbals to make it go faster, is use the 1 to 3 guy that we just opened up, and I've got space for 6 more Kerbals there. And then from there on down, it's mostly the same kind of ship, but it's 3 instead of 1. And we needed a few more stages around the edge. But you'll see the new Autostager triggering off once this gets in flight. I may have messed something up. It's not saying anything. Let me check the console. Okay, the console is sitting in a pad hold, which means basically I messed something up. And I have messed this up before, so I think I know what to look for. What it means is that my sequencer is returning a 0 when it shouldn't. And yes, that's true. I'm returning minimum of 1 millisecond or DT, and that needs to be max. So of course the bug was in the code that I changed while I was doing live coding. So moral of the story is don't trust what Greg does when he's live coding. Turn that off. Oops, wrong one. And I can just reboot from the console over here. And there we have it. There's our countdown. So same ascent profile as before. What we're looking for first is to watch the asparagus staging and make sure it works. So it's going to be this guy and its 2 buddies, and then it's going to be this guy and its 2 buddies, and then it's going to be this guy and its 2 buddies. And I have no aerodynamic surfaces on this. I'm counting on the 3 gimbaling engines in the middle for all of my attitude control until I get up into space where I can trigger the RCS. I've got some RCS jets on here as well. Okay, so the first triplet went by smoothly.
With all the buffs
It's the second one.
do they take thorns? Okay.
Beautiful. So we got 6 engines left. So I don't have any code in my ascent module that limits my speed, which means that we will get some of this aerodynamic heating during ascent. I'm not sure whether that's actually cutting our efficiency or not. I mean, on the one hand, you're fighting atmosphere. On the other hand, you're still gaining velocity lower in your trajectory. So, no birth effect? Anyway. So our throttle is cutting as our apoapsis is coming up on our target, which is I think just over 80 kilometers. And I've overtuned the code that tries to get an exact apoapsis height. So this is going to cut the throttle way back, and it's just going to inch it into place. And it should have cut the throttle because our apoapsis is high enough, and we're not out of the atmosphere. We're not out of the atmosphere yet. So it will continue to work towards, I think, 80.5 kilometers. And once we get out of the atmosphere, then we'll look and we'll say, oh, are we over 80 kilometers? If so, we can stop. 68, 69, 70 kilometers. And just after 70 kilometers, it noticed we were done. And now it's going to prepare to circularize, and it kind of jockeys back and forth a little bit. On the one hand, it wants to point prograde, but on the other hand, we have a maneuver node now, which means we're pointing in the direction of the maneuver node. And it will use RCS for that. And we've already started burning. The code to execute maneuver nodes hasn't changed a whole lot. You still see it inflating. And again, this is going to be execute the maneuver node first. And then once I'm done with the maneuver node and paused for a moment, then we'll go back and touch up the orbit to be perfectly circular or more circular. So it's throttling down as the periapsis reaches 79 kilometers. The maneuver node is getting us very close to circular. Notice the direction of the burn kind of wobbled there at the end, and we didn't tumble the craft too much, but we're done. So it ended up 79.9, 81.2, and now we've got a correction burn happening. Part of the problem is that as we rotate, we're rotating with RCS jets that are not balanced. So as we torque the craft, we're getting a net thrust. So what we'll see is if we let this happen, it'll rotate over and correct. And then it'll rotate back, and then have to rotate over and correct again on some of these. Now in this case, we got a nice one, 80.587, 80.367. And then we've done our Lambert planning already to get out to Mun. So same as the Mun Science flyby and Science orbit. We've got ourselves a nice encounter here, which just barely tips into the SOI, and we get a long limb, and we get 1.5 million meters from Mun. So we're going to head out there. We will have a correction. Very tiny errors in this burn will cause large errors in where we end up. And I've seen the errors be big enough that we don't even get an encounter. But that's okay. We're going to put a correction burn out here somewhere once we've done the burn. Just in time. Some say I overbuild my spacecraft. I'm happy with it. The key thing is that we can afford it. I've been able, because I'm automating everything, I've been able to easily run a lot of missions to send tourists to places. So when we look at our funds, I'm back up to 1.4 million. So I don't have to worry about the spaceships being a little expensive. Now, as we go further out into the system, I may have to do more careful engineering just because I need to build a spacecraft that can be built rather than building something humongous. If you build a first stage that's a little bit too big, every stage after that is a lot bigger because, the more mass you're lifting, the more fuel you have to lift it, and then the more fuel you have to lift that fuel, and so on. So Tsiolkovsky's rocket equation tells you exactly what's going on there. And it's not pretty. Although you will notice this is essentially my normal stack triplicated. So this is like flying 3 rockets in parallel. So that's one way of doing these is if you double or triple it horizontally across all stages, that comes out right. But if I tried to build this with just, normal stages, I suppose I could go with the bigger engines. I've unlocked some of the bigger engines, not a lot of them, but these engines are still working for me, so I'm still using them in my designs. Now at this point, we are at the maneuver node where we're going to correct. So it's not a big correction. I mean, that's the size of it, and the periapsis is going to head out from 1.8 down to 1.5 million, and that will change the return orbit here. So notice that we've got a zero cost free return out of this. Even though we're not actually in a retrograde orbit, it's far enough from Mun that we are ending up with a apoapsis after we depart Mun that is close enough to Kerbin. In fact, it's at Kerbin's surface right now. The key thing for us is just, to have that be close enough that we can do a small correction and get an aero capture. Now, that's going to matter not at all in a moment because, as you see, once we get inside Mun's SOI, we've got our Mun periapsis, and we're going to go ahead at the periapsis and toss ourselves into a Mun orbit. I don't trust SOI transitions in Kerbal Space Program. There we go. So you may hear the RCS jets tricking off. That's because we have to correct our pose to line up with the maneuver node that we just created, which is going to put us in this little orbit. So we had this return orbit to Kerbin, and we're about to do all sorts of bad things to it. So as we burn retrograde, it's going to collapse this in, which is going to change this orbit. It's probably going to raise the periapsis away from Kerbin. Who knows what else it's going to do. There we go. And at some point, there it is, we stay within the SOI, and it turns out that that's about where we had to stage away that first stage. So we've got a spare stage that's cycling around there. Let's turn those on. So we have this debris, which I'm not seeing the orbit. Oh, there's the debris. So the debris that we left behind is just barely inside the SOI of Kerbin. It'll keep going until we get rid of it. So our next burn is to circularize at periapsis. And again, this was a node planning thing rather than a warp until we get close and adjust. But again, same as before, do the planned maneuver, which should put us near circular orbit, and then do a touch-up to correct it until it's more circular. And I aimed at 50 kilometers. 60 kilometers is the breakpoint for science. Within 60 kilometers, you're low above Mun, and above that, you're high above Mun, I think. And there's the planned burn, which should burn until its apoapsis and periapsis are about where that shows. The precision of the maneuver nodes is pretty good. We're only 100 meters, less than 50 meters actually, that need to be corrected. I'm not even sure it's going to correct. It didn't bother. Cool. So periapsis is 50.06 kilometers, so 50 kilometers plus 60, and this is 50 kilometers plus 131. So 60 or 70 meter difference. Not bad. And we are in our upright pose. We have our antenna extended so we can continue to talk to Kerbin until it goes behind Mun, which it just did. Notice here we've got no signal. So canonically, I shouldn't be able to do anything at all to the craft at this point until we get around to the other side. So I am going to just sell it, warp around there. My code is too big to fit inside the stock parts for KOS because I do a lot of experimental stuff and tinkering stuff and lots of comments in the source code and so on. So every time it reboots, I have to reload everything from the archive. So in reality, I should have put up a constellation of satellites around Kerbin and then use that to put up a constellation of satellites around Mun. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm just waiting until I've got a view. So now this says turn off lights to return. So I make sure I'm not warping. If you're in time warp, you can't turn off the lights. So you make sure time warp is off. Then you flick the light switch, the lights go off. And I turn the lights back on to acknowledge that I've got the command, and we start with our moon departure. And I should have gone to the map view. The moon departure involves setting up a maneuver node and then adjusting it so the return orbit would have flickered back and forth really quick there. I'm sorry I didn't catch that. But it found a good time and place to burn so that when we exited Mun's SOI, we ended up on this orbit, which has a periapsis of 90 kilometers. So our exit and transfer orbit is designed to put us above the atmosphere. This allows us later on to purposefully decide how far down the atmosphere we want. So the return doesn't know much about how we want to enter. Its responsibility is to get us back to Kerbin. And some other code is going to do the aerobraking. I'm applying the single responsibility principle a lot in this code. Not as much as I've seen some places, but enough. So we did our burn. We're still touching up the end. Boom, all done. And we ended up with a 91.5 kilometer periapsis. So if we totally lost all of our engines, it would be hard to capture us. We wouldn't be going in the atmosphere. On the other hand, it wouldn't take a whole lot of thrust to push that down. It's possible that RCS thrusters might do it. We might even be able to just EVA a Kerbin out and have him push on it. Just enough to get the periapsis down to like 60 kilometers would be enough to get aerobraking and eventually land. The aero module is going to lower our periapsis down somewhere within the atmosphere. And once we get close, it's then going to burn retrograde to bring our apoapsis in to try to reduce the orbital energy. So we want to use aerobraking, but we want to also use the engine to minimize the amount of aerobraking we need. So you saw sequence aero up there. So we are in the aerobraking module. Interesting that it left us. Are we outbound? I think we're outbound still. Oh, interesting orbit. Okay, so aerobraking time warped us down to an altitude of just under 80 kilometers after dropping our periapsis down to 65 kilometers. And once we've gotten close to it, now we're burning to reduce our total orbital energy. All of that kinetic energy would become heat. So the more we can burn now, the less heat we will have. I expect that the heating will burn off our antenna because I never put any code in to close it. I have seen it from time to time burn off some of our landing legs. So we actually have enough parachutes that we can just land on our heat shields if we want. I'm wondering if clipping the landing legs into the into the parts here. I wonder if clipping them in would cause them not to get aero heating. That would be neat. Okay, so we brought our periapsis down a lot farther. Okay, so I guess I was just burning until done there. So we're going to end up doing a very sharp descent. The other thing we could do with aerobraking, if we tuned it differently, would be to burn our apoapsis down. And instead of burning it all the way down, burn it to some reasonable level and then allow the ship to do multiple aero passes. And that's actually not too bad. Each pass you burn off a lot of energy and you get a little deeper in the atmosphere and you don't end up with one, slamming it in from high altitude here like we're doing. I could manually, I'm going to go ahead and manually collapse this, retract antenna. There. We might get 10 funds or something for bringing back the antenna. So what we've got here is we have our crew areas. We have our Mark 1 capsule, and I also have a what do you call it? A Probodyne Octo. So we don't have to have a pilot anywhere in here. The Probodyne Octo is more than capable of doing the flight. It's also where we're hosting our KOS programs. And yes, in this particular build, their save, every module that has a control core has a KOS CPU in it. I will revert that at some point, but not soon. I'm still doing experimentation that requires a lot of local storage. Mostly what I'm trying to use local storage for is just persisting state, but sometimes I'll put logs out there, and that's really very helpful. Might be fun to go back and take all these scripts and do a fresh build, a fresh mission, excuse me, a fresh save that uses all these scripts and new vessels. So you build the new vessels inside the new save, and then require that require the local storage on the vessel to just be within the KOS parts. It would mean that the first few missions you couldn't use KOS on because you don't have parts until later. But yeah, we can hand fly some of those. So extra parachutes because of the extra weight. We're going to land in the water so that the landing legs actually didn't matter. At some point, I need to work out how to pick my landing spot. So we have Jeb, Valentina, Bill, Joe Barry, Fremling, Larry, and Theo Field that all have now gone up and orbited Mun. Now let's see, did I mess up with the landing? According to the console, we are in the land phase of the mission. I'm going to check really quick and make sure that it does the right thing. Phase land and phase park. So the landing phase extends the gear and unlocks steering and throttle. And the park phase just repeats the unlock steering and throttle every 10 seconds. Now the landing phase will last until our vertical speed is positive or zero. So as long as our vertical speed is negative, we're still in the land phase. Typically, my approach speed is 6 to 7 meters per second. In this case, we have 4 parachutes. We've got a little more chute than we need. So we're a little slower. That's okay. And there's our shadow. Boom, we are landed. We go into park phase and everything is shut off. So of course we just kind of heel over because our center of buoyancy and our center of mass are not the same place. I can roll this back and forth. Anyway, let's recover the vessel. So what did we get? We we have 0.4 science from going around Mun and coming back. Yeah, well, we pulled back a ton of science when we did the real orbit mission. We picked up a bunch of return parts. Curious, how much did I get for bringing back the antenna? I got back 409 funds for remembering to close the antenna. And all of my people have gained 3 XP. Well, Jebediah only gained 1 because he already had some. But these now have the level of experience that they have orbited Mun. And let's see, I can look at him. I could have gone to the training center, actually. Okay, so now you'll notice that our crew all have 1 star and about half a level here. And they've got their orange jumpsuits. I'm not sure whether that's, just because they're the starting 4 or whether they suddenly got them or not. I didn't notice that from before. So now we have all these guys. Now, if in the future we want to get some experience for the rest of these guys, we can just loft them up in this guy. How expensive is that? So we can basically spend $10,000 funds per Kerbal, give or take, to level them up by sending them out to orbit Mun. That's pretty good. Anyway, that worked well. I didn't have to intervene except, well, that one time when I closed the antenna. We all know that didn't make a difference. So I think this is a success. We now have an automated Mun, go orbit the Moon and come back. All it requires is a button that you hit on the other end to say, I'm ready to come home. That's it for this stream. It's been 45 minutes. That's not bad, but a little bit longer than I had hoped and not as long as I had feared. So see you in the next one.